Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 16. In this realm, his knowledge was so vast that the doctor from the nuns' hospital used to come and ask his advice. Nevertheless, all his knowledge was powerless to cure the chicken fever of his daughter Pancha, which had dispatched her to the hereafter. He had made her eat cow dung, and when that did not produce results, he gave her horse manure, wrapped her in blankets, and made her sweat up her illness until there was nothing left of her but skin and bones. Then he massaged her with brandy and gunpowder, but it was all useless. Pancha's life ebbed away in an interminable case of diarrhea that destroyed her body and left her with an insatiable thirst. Defeated, Pedro Garcia asked the patron for permission to take her into town on a cart. The two children went with them. The doctor in the nuns' hospital carefully examined Pancha and told the old man there was nothing he could do, that if he had brought her earlier and not induced to sweating, he would have been able to treat her, but now her body could hold no liquid. She was just like a plant when its roots had gone completely dry. Pedro Garcia took offense at that and continued to deny his failure even when he returned to the hacienda with his daughter's body wrapped in a blanket, accompanied by the two frightened children, and unloaded her in the courtyard of Tres Marias, grumbling about the doctor's ignorance. They buried her in a special plot in the graveyard alongside the abandoned church at the foot of the volcano because she had been the patron's wife, in a manner of speaking, since she had given him the only son who bore his name, though not his surname, and a grandson, the strange Esteban Garcia, who was destined to play a terrible role in the history of the family. One day, the old man Pedro Garcia told Blanca and Pedro Tercero the story of the hens who joined forces to confront a fox who came into the chicken coop every night to steal eggs and eat the baby chicks. The hens decided they had enough of the fox's abuse. They waited for him in a group, and when he entered the chicken coop, they blocked his path, surrounding him, and pecked him half to death before he knew what had happened. And that fox escaped with his tail between his legs, with all the hens chasing after him, the old man finished. Blanca laughed at the story and said it was impossible, because hens are born stupid and weak and foxes are born astute and strong. But Pedro Tercero did not laugh. He spent the whole evening absorbed in thought, ruminating on the story of the fox and the hens, and perhaps that was the night the boy began to become a man. Chapter 5, The Lovers. Blanca's childhood went by without any major surprises. The hot summers of Tres Marias, where she discovered the strength of a love that grew as she did, alternating with the routine of the city, was not unlike that of the other girls her age and class, although Clara's presence added a note of eccentricity to her life. Every morning Nana would appear with the breakfast tray to shake her from her sleep, which as she put on her uniform, stretch her socks for her, place her hat just so, help her into her gloves, arrange her handkerchief, and make sure she had all of her books, all the while mumbling prayers for the souls of the dead and loudly advising Clara not to be deceived by the nuns. Those women are all depraved, she warned her. They choose the prettiest, smartest girls from the best families to be sent to the convent. They shave the heads of the novelties, poor girls, and set them up for a lifetime of baking cakes and taking care of other people's old folks. The chauffeur took the little girl to school, where the first activity of the day was Mass and obligatory communion. Kneeling in her pew, Blanca would inhale the intense smell of the virgin incense and lilies, suffering the combined torment of nausea, guilt, and boredom. It was the only thing she disliked about the school. She loved the high vaulted stone corridors, the immaculate cleanliness of the marble floors, the naked white walls, and the iron Christ which stood in the vestibule. She was a romantic, sentimental child with a preference for solitude, for few friends, and a propensity to be moved to tears when the roses in the garden bloomed, when she smelled the rags and soaps the nuns used, as they bent over their tasks, and when she stayed behind to experience the melancholy stillness of the empty classrooms. She was considered timid and morose. Only in the country, her skin tanned by the sun and her belly full of ripe fruit, running through the fields of Pedro Tercero, was she smiling and happy. Her mother said that was the real Blanca, and that the other one, the one back in the city, was a Blanca in hibernation. Because of the constant agitation that reigned in the big house in the corner, no one except Nana noticed that Blanca was becoming a woman. She entered adolescence overnight. She had inherited the trib of Spanish and Arab blood, their regal bearing and haughty grin, and the olive skin and dark eyes of her Mediterranean genes, all colored by her mother's heritage, from which she drew a sweetness no Trueba had ever known. She was a tranquil soul who entertained herself, studied hard, played with her dolls, and showed not the slightest inclination for her mother's spiritualism or her father's fits of rage. The family jokingly said that she was the only normal person for many generations, and it was true. She was a miracle of equilibrium and serenity. At around 13, she began to develop breasts. She lost weight, her waist thinned out, and she shot up like a transplanted tree. Nana pulled her hair back in a bun and took her to buy her first corset, her first pair of silk stockings, her first grown-up dress, and a collection of miniature towels for which she continued to call demonstration. Meanwhile, her mother continued making chairs dance through the house, playing Chopin with the lid of the piano shut, and declaiming the beautiful verses of a young poet she had taken under her wing, a poet she was beginning to be talked about everywhere, never noticing the split seams of the schoolgirl's uniform, or seeing that the apple face of her daughter was subtly changing into the face of a grown woman, because Clara paid more attention to auras and fluids than she did to pounds and inches. One day she saw her walk into the sewing room in her party dress and was astonished to discover that the tall, dark lady was little Blanca. She put her arms around her, covered her with kisses, and warned her that she would soon begin to menstruate. Sit down and let me tell you what it is, Clara said. Don't worry, Mama. I've already had it once a month for the past year, her daughter said, laughing. The relationship between them underwent no major changes with the girl's development because it was based on the solid principle of mutual acceptance and the ability to laugh together at almost everything. That year, summer arrived early with a sultry heat that covered the city with its nightmare glare. The family decided to advance their departure for Tres Marias by 2 weeks. As always, Blanca eagerly awaited the moment of seeing Pedro Tercero again, and as she had every year, the first thing she did on climbing down from the coach was run to look for him with her eyes glued to where she knew he would be standing. She saw his hidden shadow in the doorway and jumped from the vehicle, hurtling toward him with the eagerness of all of her months of anticipation, but to her surprise the boy turned on his heel and fled. All that afternoon Blanca went to each of their special meeting spots asking for him, shouting his name, even looking for him at the house of old Pedro Garcia, his grandfather. Finally, at sundown, she went to bed defeated, without eating supper. In her huge brass bed, shocked and hurt, she buried her face in her pillow and cried inconsolably. Nana brought her a glass of milk and honey, understanding in a flash the reason for her grief. It's about time, she said with a twisted smile. You're too old to be playing with that flea-ridden brat. Half an hour later, her mother came to kiss her good night and found her sobbing the last gasps of a melodramatic sorrow. For a moment, Clara ceased to be a distracted angel and came to stand beside a simple mortal who suffered, at 14, the first torments of love. She wanted to inquire, but Blanca was very proud, were already too much of a woman and would tell her nothing, so Clara just stood beside her bed and caressed her until she calmed down. That night Blanca slept fitfully and woke at dawn, surrounded by the shadows of her large bedroom. She lay in bed staring up at the cuffed ceiling until she heard the first rooster crow. Then she got up, opened the curtains, and left the soft morning light in the first sounds of the world enter the room. She walked over to the mirror on the wardrobe and stared at herself for a long time. She took off her nightgown, and for the first time she looked at her body in detail, and as she did, she soon realized that it was because of all these changes that her friend had run away. She smiled, a new, delicate smile, the smile of a woman. She put on her old clothes from the preceding summer, which were almost too small, wrapped herself in a shawl, and tiptoed out so as not to wake the rest of the family. Outside, the fields were shaking off their sleep, and the first rays of sunlight were cutting the peaks of the Cordelia like the thrust of a saber, warming up the earth and evaporating the dew into a fine white foam that blurred the edges of things and turned this landscape into an enchanted dream. Blanca set off in the direction of the river. Everything was still quiet. Her footsteps crushed the fallen leaves and the dry branches, producing like light crunching sound, the only noise in the vast sleeping space. She felt that the shaggy meadows, the golden wheat fields, and the far-off purple mountains disappearing in the clear morning sky were part of some ancient memory, something she had seen before exactly like this, as if she had already lived in this moment in some previous life. The delicate rain of the night had soaked the earth and trees, and her clothing felt slightly damp, her shoes cold. She inhaled the perfume of the drenched earth and the rotten leaves and the hummus, which awakened an unknown pleasure in all her senses. Blanca arrived at the river and found her childhood friend sitting at the spot where they met so many times. That year, Pedro Tercero had not grown as much as she had. He was the same thin, dark child as always, with the same protruding belly and the old man's expression in his black eyes. When he saw her, he stood up, and she guessed that she was at least half a head taller than he. They looked at each other disconcertedly, feeling for the first time in their lives that they were practically strangers. For what seemed like an infinite time, they stood immobile, adjusting to the changes and the new distances, but then a sparrow trilled and everything reverted to the way it had been the preceding summer. Once again, they were two children running, hugging, laughing, falling on the ground, rolling over and over, crashing against the pebbles, murmuring each other's names, elated to be back together. Finally, they calmed down. Her hair was full of dry leaves, which he removed one by one. "Come here, I want to show you something," said Pedro Tercero. He took her by the hand. They walked along, savoring that reawakening of the world, dragging their feet through the mud, picking tender greens to suck out their sap, looking at each other and smiling without speaking, until they reached a distant field. The sun was just appearing over the volcano, but the day had not settled in yet, and the earth was still yawning. Pedro told her to throw herself flat on the ground and be very quiet. They crawled along, coming close to some clumps of underbrush, which made a short detour, and suddenly Blanca saw it. It was a beautiful bay mare in the process of giving birth alone on the hillside. The children did not move. Trying to keep even their breath silent, they watched her pant and push until they saw the colt's head appear, and then after a while the rest of its body. The little animal fell to the ground, and the mother began to lick it, leaving it as clean and shiny and as waxed wood, coaxing it with her muzzle to stand up. The colt tried to get up on its feet, but its fragile newborn legs folded under it, and it fell down, looking helplessly up as its mother, who neighed a greeting in the morning sun. Blanca felt her breast shoot with joy and tears come to her eyes. "When I grow up, I'm going to marry you, and we're going to live here in Tres Marias," she whispered. Pedro stared at her and his sad old man's look and shook his head. He was still much more of a child than she, but he already knew his place in the world. He also knew he would love this girl as long as he lived, that this dawn would live in his memory, and it would be the last thing he would see before he died. They spent the summer oscillating between childhood, which still held them in its clasp, and their awakening as man and woman. There were times when they ran like little children, steering up the chickens and exciting the cows, drinking their fill of fresh milk and winding up with foam mustaches, stealing fresh bread straight from the oven, and clambering up trees to build secret houses. At other times they hid in the forest's thickest, most secret recesses, making beds of leaves and pretending they were married, caressing each other until they fell asleep exhausted. They were still innocent enough to remove their clothes without a trace of curiosity and swim naked in the river as they always had, diving into the cold water and letting the current pull them down against the shiny stones. But there were certain things they could no longer share. They learned to feel shame in each other's presence. They no longer competed to see who could make the biggest puddle when they urinated, and Blanca did not tell him of the dark matter that stained her underwear once a month. Without anyone telling them, they realized they could not act so freely in front of others. When Blanca dressed up as a young lady and sat on the terrace sipping lemonade with her family each afternoon, Pedro Tercero would watch her from afar without coming closer. They began to hide when they wanted to play. They stopped walking hand in hand within sight of the adults, and they ignored each other so as not to attract attention. Nana gave a sigh of relief, but Clara started watching them more carefully. The vacation was over, and the Truebas returned to the city laden with jars of candy, preserves, boxes of fruit, cheese, pickled chicken and rabbit, and baskets full of eggs. While everything was being packed away in the cars that would take them to the train, Blanca and Pedro Tercero hid in the cannery to say their goodbyes. In those 3 months they had come to love each other with the ecstatic passion that would torment them for the rest of their lives. With time their love became more persistent and invulnerable, but it already had the depth and certainty that characterized it later on. Atop a pile of grain, breathing in the pungent dust of the granary and the diffuse, golden morning air light that filtered through the chinks, they kissed, licked, bit, and sucked each other, sobbed and drank each other's tears, swore eternal love, and drew up a secret code that would allow them to communicate during the coming months of separation. Everyone who witnessed the moment agrees that it was almost 8 o'clock at night when Ferrula appeared without the slightest warning. They all saw her in her starched blouse, with the ring of keys on her waist and her old maid's bun, exactly as they had always seen her in that house. She entered the dining room just as Esteban was beginning to carve the roast, and they organized her immediately. Even though it had been 6 years since they last saw her, and she looked very pale and a great deal older. It was Saturday, and the twins Jamie and Nicholas had come home from school for the weekend, so they too were at the table. Their testimony is very important because they were the only members of the family who lived completely removed from the three-legged table, protected from magic and spiritualism by their rigid English boarding school. First, they felt a sudden draft in the dining room, and Clara ordered the windows shut because she thought it was the wind. Then they heard the tinkling of the keys, and the door burst open, and Ferrula appeared, speaking and with a distant expression on her face. At the exact same moment that Nana came in from the kitchen carrying the salad platter, Esteban stopped with the carving fork and, suspended in midair, paralyzed with surprise, and the three children cried, "Aunt Ferrula!" almost in unison. Blanca managed to raise her feet to greet her, but Clara, who was seated beside her, reached out her hand and held her back. Clara was actually the only one to realize on the first glance what was going on, despite the fact that nothing in her sister-in-law's appearance in any way betrayed her state. Ferrula stopped 3 feet from the table, looked at everyone with her empty, indifferent eyes, and advanced toward Clara, who stood up but made no effort to go any closer, and only closing her eyes and breathing rapidly as if she were about to have one of her asthma attacks. Ferrula approached her, but a hand on her each shoulder, and kissed her on the forehead. All that could be heard in the dining room was Clara's labored breathing and the metallic clang of keys at Ferulla's waist. After kissing her sister-in-law, Ferrula walked around her and went on the way that she came in, closing the door behind her. The family sat frozen in the dining room as if they were in the middle of a nightmare. Suddenly, Nana began to shake so hard that the salad spoons fell off the platter. The sound of the silver as it hit the floor made everybody jump. Clara opened her eyes. She was having difficulty breathing, and tears were running down her cheeks and staining her blouse. "Ferrula is dead," she announced.